This video is sponsored by World Anvil. A couple of months ago, I made a video about the changes made to orcs in D&D 2024. In that video, I discussed, among a lot of other topics, it was a long video, but one of the things I talked about was how the change to orcs kind of represented a shift in Dungeons & Dragons. A shift that's been playing out for a few years now, where it seems like the core rulebooks themselves aren't really capable of world building anymore. The game itself is struggling to establish a unified set of principles that are true no matter what D&D game you're playing, because it's trying to provide a toolset that can apply to any of the established D&D campaign settings, as well as your own homebrew world. And the problem I presented in that video was that this friction is essentially grinding down and eroding the specific details from D&D lore, so they're no longer present in the current game. And while there's definitely a lot of old lore from the game that I don't really miss on principle, the problem is that it's not always being replaced with anything because the corporation behind D&D is more interested in avoiding criticism than they are in exercising creativity and replacing that lore with something that could actually still apply to our own games no matter what world we're playing in. When given a choice between sticking to the old, problematic lore and replacing it with new, more palatable lore, they just took the cowardly third path and stripped the lore out of the books entirely, so if your DM includes problematic lore in their games, hey, that's on them. That is not the fault of Wizards of the Coast or their parent company Hasbro. And since I released that video, we've seen the release of Daggerheart from Darrington Press, and this game has been a huge hit right out of the gate. But I think one of the reasons why might have passed a lot of people by. I think Daggerheart tries to tackle the same problem that D&D 2024 does, making a game that can be played in lots of different campaign settings, especially worlds like Exandria from Critical Role, worlds that share a lot of DNA with the classic campaign settings from Dungeons & Dragons. But I think Daggerheart's approach to world building sidesteps a lot of the same problems D&D 2024 wrestled with. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Does Daggerheart handle different settings better than D&D? If you like this video and you want to see me make more Daggerheart videos in the future, make sure to subscribe, like the video, let YouTube know that you want to see more videos like it. I have so many more thoughts about Daggerheart that I want to get to in future videos, and I will definitely prioritize them if you all demonstrate that you're hungry for more Daggerheart content. So like, subscribe, ring the bell, and let me know in the comments if you want more Daggerheart videos. I'd really appreciate it. The first thing that sets Daggerheart apart from D&D is that the core rulebook makes very few assumptions about the default world of the game. In the world of D&D, there are a lot of core assumptions being made. Some of them are obvious, like how the magic system works, how monsters are born or created, what sort of goals these monsters have, certain iconic magic items, that kind of thing. But as you go through the core rulebooks, you'll find all kinds of other elements of world building embedded within the game. You have spells named after legendary NPCs like Tasha and Mordenkainen and Big B and Melf. You have not just iconic monsters, but iconic villains who are tied into the DNA of the game, like Vecna, and his eternal rivalry with his old henchman Cass the Bloody-Handed. Both these characters are basically always referenced in the magic item section of the Dungeon Master's Guide. But in Daggerheart, there is no core world, so there are very few core assumptions made about the world your game takes place in. There are the different ancestries, and we'll talk about those more in a second, but as far as details given about the world of the game, we only get a few. The two categories of gods, a vague gesture at a creation myth, and the general categories of the different planes of existence. The book tells us that the forgotten gods created the material world, and presumably all the people who live there, though that's not confirmed, but they also used to travel to and from the material world all the time. Then they were overthrown by the new gods, and some of the forgotten gods were trapped in the material world while others were cast down into the circles below, while the new gods stole their homes in the hollows above. There's also a reference to a couple of other divine beings, the faint divinities, who were created by both the forgotten and new gods, and who can be found in a bunch of different planes and are far more capricious characters. And we get a very brief reference to other planes of existence, the elemental lands, the astral realm, the Valley of Death, and countless others, close quote. So far, it sounds a lot like a typical D&D campaign setting, just with a few names removed, which the folks at Critical Role are no stranger to having to do. They've had to come up with some copyright-free names of existing gods before. And in fact, with the exception of one pretty important detail in the timeline, this creation myth sounds very similar to the origin of Matt Mercer's world of Exandria. But that change in the timeline actually makes it very clear that Daggerheart does not take place in Exandria, at least not by default. Basically, the fact that the new gods came from somewhere else and overthrew the forgotten gods, well, that's not how things happened with the creation myth in Exandria. They did not split their time in the same way. So this is not Exandria. As far as other world building goes, in Chapter 4, the environment stat blocks, we get one more little bit of world building with the introduction of the Chaos Realm, described as an otherworldly space where the laws of reality are unstable and dangerous. And as far as world building goes, that's pretty much it. Now, it's not uncommon for tabletop games to try to limit their world building to just the stuff that can inspire new stories, rather than trying to force its players and GMs to run in a specific world these days. But even when D&D tries that approach, there are a lot of other assumptions the game makes, which it feels like the game is wrestling with a lot of the time. For example, we just talked about the whole problem with the orcs. If you're going to make orcs a playable species in your game, you have to contend with the fact that you've spent decades establishing that Grumsh is the god of the orcs. He created them, and many of them still worship him. and he's also frequently at war with the other gods. Even in the new player's handbook, the orcs still venerate Grumsh, but he's been watered down and reframed as more of a wandering god rather than a vengeful god, because D&D can't decouple him from orcs in general. Grumsh has to still be the creator of the orcs, and the orcs are playable now, so Grumsh maybe isn't that bad anymore. But in Daggerheart, the game isn't wrestling with any of that stuff. The description of the orcs is bonkers simple. We get absolutely no content that tells us anything about their culture, their place in society, their religion. All we get is a little note about how some orcs decorate their tusks. In all other ways, they might as well just be humans with tusks. And I know that's an idea that rubs some players and game masters out there the wrong way. Some players might miss specific lore from certain species. For example, in my orc video, I talked about how D&D dropped the idea that tieflings are, by default, a persecuted minority, because it felt like that was giving players the opportunity to play as a stereotyped individual, and the designer's rationalization for removing that detail was that that's really a decision that should be made at your table, rather than being made by the game itself. But I got some really insightful comments that pointed out that an aspect of tieflings I'd never really considered was they're also a fantastic allegory for being trans or otherwise queer. I never really liked the idea of tiefling virtue names, that was part of the lore I never really connected with. But some commenters made a great point that it lends itself incredibly well to the trans allegory, because it represents the idea that you have to choose your own name that sums up your identity, and that it honestly never occurred to me, but it's a fantastic way to approach the concept of tieflings and virtue names. And so that's a perfect example of how some players really enjoyed some specific lore that was in earlier editions of the game, but was essentially absent from core rulebooks that were published later on. However, if we step away from specific examples and discuss just the broader idea of creatures that used to be monsters now being player characters in RPGs, there are some game masters and world builders who don't like that change. They don't really like the idea that different species don't feel distinct from each other. If there's no lore that separates an elf from a dwarf or an orc from a gnome, then it really is all just cosmetic and stats based. And to be honest, that is a perfectly reasonable argument, but it's also an approach that the hobby overall is drifting away from with lots of different games, not just D&D and Daggerheart. And I do kind of think it's an inevitable change anytime you turn any creatures into playable characters, even for the classic ancestries like elves and dwarves. And we don't really have time to litigate that topic today, so maybe we'll talk about that in another video some other time. But if that's something you don't enjoy about modern D&D, for example, then I could definitely see the argument that this trend is even worse in Daggerheart, because now there's not even any passing lip service made to any of the old lore like there is in the D&D Player's Handbook. And then there are the new ancestries included in Daggerheart. See, this game doesn't just have the typical fantasy races you might see in most tabletop RPGs, like elves and dwarves and halflings, but they also have clanks, dracona, fairies, fauns, furbolgs, fungril, galapa, giants, goblins, inferni, Qatari, ribbits, and simia. Now, if you're an old-school D&D player who tends to like the classic ancestries, like humans and elves and dwarves and halflings, and you don't like all the new creatures in modern D&D, then honestly, most of these ancestries probably seem pretty high fantasy in a way that you might not vibe with. When we've got cat people and frog people, we've come pretty far from Tolkien and Howard and Martin. But a lot of D&D players who enjoy Critical Role don't necessarily mind a game that doesn't focus on a human-centric world. But even for some of those D&D players, it's hard to imagine how you could integrate some of these wacky ancestries into a D&D world that still feels like medieval fantasy and not like a cartoon world. Now, Dracona and Inferni are inspired by Dragonborn and Tieflings, don't tell anybody, and those have been in the D&D Player's Handbooks since 4th edition back in 2008, so that's almost 20 years. That is not such a huge leap for a lot of modern players. Clanks are basically Warforged from Eberron, and even though not every Dungeon Master allows you to play a robot in their game, some GMs are cool with it. And in a previous Critical Role campaign, Matt Mercer demonstrated how you could incorporate automatons into your medieval fantasy game in a pretty smart way, which helps them feel like more a part of the fantasy world. So, while the idea of robots in D&D is a deal breaker for a lot of people, there's also a precedent in Critical Role specifically that can help other players and GMs rationalize them in their own settings. Goblins and orcs have been playable in D&D for a few years now, and honestly, unless you strongly feel that these ancestries should just be monsters by default, you probably understand the basic idea that because these monsters exist in the world and have civilizations and cultures of their own, it's probably reasonable that some players would want to play these creatures in their games, and they could be members of adventuring parties. Once again, Daggerheart did not remake the wheel here. They've been playable ancestries in D&D 5e for most of its lifespan. They're playable in Shadowdark. This is part of a larger trend. Fauns and Furbolgs are rarer ancestries, but they've been part of D&D for at least a few years now, at least in 5e, and they've had a major role in Critical Role. No pun intended. Giants in Daggerheart are not that different from Goliaths, which again are a big part of Critical Role. Galapa are based on the Turtles from D&D, and while those were an optional race in 5th edition, only appearing in one supplement, they are also a really important Turtle NPC in a 5th edition adventure, and once again, a Turtle NPC in Critical Role. So for a lot of Daggerheart players who like to watch Critical Role, the idea of a Galapa being in a fantasy world is not that crazy. And while the Qatari are certainly similar to the Tabaxi from D&D, I actually think you can also draw a direct parallel to the Khajiit in Skyrim. That was an incredibly popular game that still presented what we all think of as a fairly typical medieval fantasy world and included cat people as part of the fantasy without breaking the immersion for a lot of players. And the Simia are monkey people. That's something you might find in Planet of the Apes, or famously, maybe infamously, in Spelljammer. And even setting aside all the other issues I had with the Hadozi, I always hated their stupid little wing flaps, so if we can play monkey people with no wings and no problematic lore, hell yeah, sign me up. So while not all players will vibe with all these ancestries, I don't think any one of them is necessarily a deal breaker for a fantasy world that still feels like the medieval fantasy a lot of us are used to. But even if a D&D player or GM is completely used to all these ancestries being part of their fantasy worlds, I think Daggerheart still pushes the envelope, because they've also got fairies, fungus people, and little frog dudes. Yeah, fairies exist in D&D, but they're not usually playable, and the same goes for fungus people. I didn't know anyone who was begging to play a Myconid. And there was also a playable race of frog people in D&D. They were called the Grung, but they were also gated off into their own supplements, restricted to one location in the world of the Forgotten Realms, and never really canonized with any other important NPCs, the way even the Turtles were. But let's be fair. Part of the reason for the disconnect doesn't just have to do with the fact that there are frog people at all. It's also specifically the art. I love the Ribbits. I think this dude is absolutely adorable. I think the art is incredible. Some of my favorite art in the book is art of Ribbits. But the Ribbit art is also very whimsical. And if you're used to running games that take themselves more seriously, the idea that you can also include this adorable little Fern Gully looking dude in your Game of Thrones inspired fantasy epic is potentially going to be a tough pill to swallow. Even the fairies don't feel as jarringly Fern Gully-esque, ironically, because they're generally more insectoid in appearance in Daggerheart. But the Ribbit? That's Little Frog Boy. And the art for the Little Frog Boy is always incredible. Every time they're depicted in the book, they look amazing. But they also always look like little frog boys. And not everybody wants their gritty fantasy world to include little frog boys. I've talked about this before, way back, in my video about whether or not you should ban any of the official D&D ancestries from your game. But everybody has their own threshold for when something becomes too weird or too silly and breaks their immersion in the fantasy world. As I said in that video, my weirdness threshold for how many weirdos should be in a D&D party is probably higher than a lot of other people's. Because while other people's point of inspiration for fantasy might be Lord of the Rings or Conan, which are very human-centric stories, mine is more commonly Star Wars, which is very high fantasy, and every team of characters in that franchise usually includes at least one wacky alien, if not more, and at least one wacky robot, if not more. However, if you're playing your Daggerheart campaign in a world you already know well, either a pre-published setting like Exandria or the Forgotten Realms, or a homebrew world you've been working on for a long time, then it can be hard to imagine how there are suddenly just a bunch of fungus people and frog people running around in your world when that was never your intention when you built it. But here's the thing. Daggerheart obviously wants to give you the freedom to play in your own campaign setting if that's really what you want to do. There's a section in the Session 0 chapter that says you can ignore their world-building advice and just tell your players about your game world and answer their questions about it. However, that comes after a paragraph where they tell you all about how you can build your world with your players. Because this is the guidance they give you about world building in Session 0. This is from page 172. Whether you're using the guidance in the upcoming Running a Campaign section, a campaign frame from Campaign 5, or your own world building tools, facilitate the process of creating or fleshing out the setting for your campaign. During the process, think about the elements, tropes, genres, influences the players are especially interested in. Then do what you can to build these elements into the setting. World building can be engrossing, but you don't need to define or name every part of the map at this stage. Leave yourself blank spaces to fill in later as you continue to build the setting together through play. Alternatively, you may instead want to introduce players to a setting you've created. Use this time to introduce your setting and answer any questions they might have. Now, we just did a video earlier this week about world building in Daggerheart, like the actual process of creating a world collaboratively and how it mirrors the way Matt Mercer used to build his worlds for Critical Role using the input of his players and their backstories. Go check out that video right here if you haven't watched it yet. But I think it's important to note that the game assumes you're going to build a world with your players, which means you're going to build a world that includes all the characters your players want to play, and all the creatures they want to play. You may not have an idea for how Ribbits will fit into the gritty campaign setting you want to run, but if none of your players want to play Ribbits, then you don't have to worry about that. However, if you do have a player who wants to play a Ribbit, then in Session 0, when you all build a world together, you can loop them into the creative process. You can say, I'm having a hard time visualizing where these little frog boys live in this world. Where do you think they live? I don't know if they have a huge role in society, especially politically, so maybe they're a little bit more like the Hobbits and the Lord of the Rings, off doing their own thing somewhere. But what do you think? Where do you want them to live? How involved do you want them to be with the wider world? Do you want them to be just a fact of life in this setting, or are they more rare, isolated to their own community? It's okay if you don't have an idea on how to incorporate some of these more bizarre ancestries into the game, because you're not the only one building the world. But of course, I mentioned Daggerheart does not have an established default core world, and that's true. But it does present several different worlds you can play in. This is one of the big selling points of Daggerheart, the campaign frames. And the way they're put together is so smart, because they don't just present a setting, but they also give you a bunch of story hooks. But this also means that each of these worlds is designed to operate within the boundaries of the game, for the most part, more on that later. But this means they're going to incorporate all the ancestries. To be honest, we might do a whole other video about campaign frames because I'm not going to dive into each of these settings in a lot of detail today. Instead, I want to talk about essentially how they offer their own world building you can use in tandem with the Daggerheart system to create different experiences at the table. For example, if we stick with the ancestries, different campaign frames have different approaches to these ancestries. In the Witherwild campaign frame, which, speaking very generally for today's purposes, is essentially about a civilized community and a forest community coming into conflict. But in the setting, we're told that the different clanks from the different communities are made of different materials, depending on if they're from the civilized nation or the more wilderness nation. Fungrils come from the forest, of course, and the same goes for many Galapa and Ribbits. So these ancestries have specific homes within the setting. However, with something like Five Banners Burning, the political intrigue, Game of Thrones style setting, all these ancestries are just part of that world. They can be from any of these nations, and the NPCs in the inciting incidents are all members of these more colorful ancestries. Okay, but what about Age of Umbra? That's the spooky Dark Souls setting. You can't have cute little frog boys in your Dark Souls setting. Well, the folks who made this game seem to agree, because in Age of Umbra, the Ribbits aren't little frog boys. They're 6 to 8 feet tall, and they prefer to skulk on all fours. And it's a little more interesting, isn't it? Dracona get similar treatment. They lean forward and use their tails to balance them, like dinosaurs. And Clanks, in Age of Umbra, Clanks received a major change. They're not automatons created with artificial life. They were holy vessels for the gods themselves. But then the gods left, and many Clanks have been inert ever since. But Daggerheart also doesn't shy away from imposing restrictions. If you play Motherboard, the sci-fi post-apocalyptic setting, you can't play a Clank. Sure, that might seem a little strange to you that this far future technological wasteland has frog dudes and fairies, but that's not where they drew the line in the sand when they were developing it. Instead, they said that it makes no sense for you to play a robot in the world of rogue robots. And to be honest, that really surprised me. Your ranger can have a robot companion, but there's just a chance it will be corrupted and go wild the way that other robots in the setting seem to do. Surely, players might want to play a robot who happens to look more humanoid and is also at the risk of succumbing to the same corruption. But a designer said, nope, doesn't matter. Playing a robot in this setting makes absolutely no sense, so you can't do it. And to be honest, even though I don't necessarily agree with that specific line in the sand, I'm glad they have one. I'm glad they're not afraid to say, yeah, we know our ancestors are weird and they're not going to be compatible with every fantasy. Do your best to make them work for whatever you can. For most of these settings, they've been designed to incorporate these wackier ancestries. But if you have an idea for a campaign setting or a campaign frame that is not compatible with one or more of our Daggerheart ancestries, well, so did we. We just cut that one ancestry from that campaign frame. Do what you have to do. And thankfully, the campaign frames do a great job of offering guidance for all sorts of different character options. They tell you where you might be from based on different backgrounds you choose. And when it comes to classes, each campaign frame tends to offer some guidance to make you better fit your character into the world based on what class you play. In Witherwild, different character classes make the most sense to belong to one side of the conflict or the other. On the other hand, in Age of Umbra, you can play any class and belong to any corner of civilization, but certain classes might receive a lot more scrutiny or judgment from the NPCs you encounter. And these settings also play with the expectations we have for Daggerheart based on the assumptions made at the front of the book. Sure, Daggerheart assumes there are forgotten gods and new gods, but a lot of the different campaign frames have their own takes on how the gods work. In Witherwild, the gods are basically huge animals who live in the wilderness. In Five Banners Burning, there's a reference to the gods leaving to fight otherworldly foes. In Age of Umbra, the gods basically fled the world entirely. Motherboard doesn't even have any true gods, at least not that we know of. If you're playing a Seraph, you just worship the machines. And a bunch of the campaign frames also have specific mechanics. Five Banners Burning has a way to track your players' relationships with the different factions and objective countdowns to keep track of their tasks. Beast Feast has a whole bunch of mechanics for preparing the food. Age of Umbra has corruption mechanics and the beacon fires that protect the people from monsters. Motherboard has a crafting system and a whole code language. So the game is really clear. The system is the bare bones, but each new setting will have its own demands. Don't be afraid to introduce new mechanics or toy with the existing lore, what little there is, so you can better capture the goals of your setting. But also, the campaign frames specifically tell you what you should tell your players. The first page is the pitch, and then the next few pages specifically are labeled, if your group decides to play this campaign, give your players the following information before character creation. There are questions to pose to your group for character creation, things like whether you're all from the same place in Five Banners Burning. Whereas in Beast Feast, you definitely are all from the same place. That's part of the premise. But for that campaign frame, we get some great questions for a Mega Dungeon campaign. What life goal do they hope to accomplish in the caves? What do they miss from home? Why do they join the adventure? What favor will they ask when they get back? I think it is so smart that the campaign frames basically tell you how much information to give your players about your world before you actually start playing. But of course, what about once the campaign actually begins? How do you give them other information throughout the campaign? Well, you can use today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is a fantastic online toolkit you can use to keep track of all the details of your campaign setting, like creating articles and timelines you can reference back to whenever you want. For example, you could create an article all about orcs or clanks or ribbits, and add in your own ideas of what their culture is like in your world. You can create articles for different cities or settlements that you and your fellow players came up with during Session 0. You can come up with names and identities for the gods, both the forgotten and the new. And then, as your players learn more about these pantheons, you can start sharing these articles with them so they can check out all of your lore at their own pace, since not everybody really absorbs information if you just download it to them verbally in the middle of a game session. Sometimes they want to read it themselves, and World Anvil helps you do that. And you can make some of these articles private until the time you want to reveal this information to your players. A big part of Daggerheart is also the idea that the player characters are connected to the world in some way. That's why you build a world together during Session 0. And when you use World Anvil, you can use their auto-linker feature to connect different articles together. Gone are the days when you have to scroll through every page you've created and manually add hyperlinks to the other relevant articles. Now with just a couple of clicks of a button, you can make sure that any article that references the Forgotten Gods or the Roving Robots will include a link to the article about that topic. Because the folks at World Anvil are gamers themselves, and they understand how we use these tools to enhance our games. And World Anvil is offering a discount to the viewers of this channel. If you visit worldanvil.com/SuperGeekMike and use the promo code SuperGeek at checkout, you can save 51% off of any annual membership. Once again, that's worldanvil.com/SuperGeekMike and use the promo code SuperGeek. Thanks so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. If you feel like some of these ancestries feel a little bit too goofy for the kinds of fantasy games you want to play in, that's understandable, and it's possible that means Daggerheart is not the right game for you and your group. However, Matt Mercer also apparently felt like the world he wanted to create for Daggerheart, Age of Umbra, was not really compatible with the ancestors they had created for Daggerheart, particularly the frog people and the robots. So we just offered suggestions for how you can reskin those creatures in your games, which should help them match the tone and narrative of this campaign frame. And this brings me to my next argument. Daggerheart lends itself better to reskinning than Dungeons & Dragons does. For example, we can look at Motherboard. The whole premise of this campaign frame is that you replace magic with technology. You give the players the freedom to describe how they're doing that, they can decide what technology they use when they cast certain spells, but the reason you can get away with that so easily in Daggerheart, where it might be more of a challenge in Dungeons & Dragons, is because you're not tracking the same sort of costs when you spend resources in Daggerheart. Because D&D assumes that a lot of things you're doing are going to require gold. That's true for spells, it's true for downtime activities, it's even true for some class features like wizards adding spells to your spellbook. Part of the bookkeeping of Dungeons & Dragons is keeping track of how much gold things cost, and that is part of the resource management aspect of the game. We can have our frustrations with whether or not D&D does that well. Certainly a lot of digital ink has been spilled on the fact that the economies of your typical Dungeons & Dragons worlds make absolutely no sense, but from a game balance perspective, there's a reason you gatekeep resurrection spells behind gold costs, to make it not so trivially easy to raise the dead, even when you've unlocked that spell. In Daggerheart, your resources are hope, stress, hit points, and armor slots. And these are resources that could be applied to any character in any campaign setting. You don't have to worry about gold in the same way. You don't have to worry about replacing magic with technology, meaning that you have to find some replacement for spell slots or for material components that are supposed to be specifically very rare. You don't have to worry about any of the class features that are prescribed so characters match the core fantasy D&D is aiming for. Daggerheart is a game that's just a lot easier to reskin than other games are. If you wanted to play in a game where everyone is human and you didn't have any of these more wacky ancestries, you could do that. You could run a game set in the Marvel universe. Everyone's basically human, but you find whatever ancestry gives you the best bonus to match your character's superpowers, and use those as your ancestries. Is Spider-Man a fairy, and you reskin his flying as web swinging? Or do you make his web shooters a piece of his inventory since he designed his web shooters, and he could potentially run out of web fluid that way? If that's the case, then maybe he's a simia or a ribbit, because you can choose whether you want to be more of a climber or a jumper, whatever's going to make the most sense in making you feel like Spider-Man. You could pretty easily make that change, and it doesn't harm the Daggerheart experience in any way, because there's no default world for Daggerheart. In a lot of ways, this game represents the design sensibility that D&D is kind of aiming for, but is unable to reach all the way because they also want to present the lore that has been an essential part of the game for the past 50 years. And I don't think you can have it both ways. I don't think you could have a game where all these ancestries have all this important mythology that ties them into the larger D&D multiverse, and also make those ancestries essentially interchangeable to give your players as much freedom as they want. I say this as somebody who likes D&D 2024. I don't think it's a bad product by any means. But I think the designers are struggling to adapt to the mindset of a lot of modern gamers, which is that a lot of players just want to play whichever ancestry gives them the best powers, and it's going to be very difficult to convince them to incorporate world building into their role-playing. So the approach Daggerheart takes is just to remove the default world building from the game and focus on only specific world building for specific worlds. There's no Daggerheart multiverse where all these different worlds play by the same rules because they're linked through dragons or portals or whatever else is the case in Dungeons & Dragons, where this entire multiverse of worlds all share some defining characteristics like spell slots and certain kinds of monsters. Daggerheart is simply a toolkit. It is a frame that you can hang any other world upon, and you can start changing whatever you want to make it match that world. It definitely leans more fantastical than a lot of other games. We haven't even talked about the fact that players can choose magical weapons at level 1, and that is a whole other conversation we're going to have to do in another video. But if you want to remove the frog people from your game of Daggerheart, I mean, I don't think I would do that personally, but I understand where you're coming from. It's up to you. I do think it's worth pointing out that if you don't want ribbits in your Daggerheart game, you have to make sure the other players aren't going to want them either, otherwise you're going to wind up with some ribbits. Because not only are the frog people really fun and cute, and I like them, but they're also one of the most iconic pieces of this game, so removing them is going to mean losing something that I think actually draws a lot of other players to this game, which is some of the wackier characters you can play. But that being said, you can still do that and do it really easily, because there is no defined world for Daggerheart that you must play in, and you can invent a Daggerheart world that doesn't have any ribbits in it. And my ultimate point is that any change you make to Daggerheart, especially in regards to world building, is not going to put you at odds with the game system in the same way it often does with Dungeons & Dragons. D&D 5th edition was designed to be modular, where you could add additional rules if you wanted to create certain experiences with the game. Daggerheart takes that idea to another level, which means the game itself makes very few assumptions about the world you're playing in, but the moment you start building the world, the game winds up being a very versatile resource that you can use no matter what setting you're playing in. That being said, this entire topic depends a lot on your needs as a game master. If you're someone like me who already has a lot of very clear ideas about how you want to use certain monsters in your games, based on ideas you've generated across a few years or decades, I should say, of reading lots of different D&D handbooks and watching D&D actual play shows, then Daggerheart just gives you some new stats that you can use for whatever monsters you want to invent, or you can take some of these stat blocks and apply them to the monsters you're familiar with from D&D. Carry over those older ideas into your game and use D&D concepts in your Daggerheart game. That's essentially what Matt Mercer did during his home game, in the first half of what we now know as Campaign 1 of Critical Role. One of the villains the party faced was the Dread Emperor, who was a bad guy from D&D 3rd edition or 3.5. But they were playing in Pathfinder, so he just lifted a villain he was familiar with, possibly adjusted the stats. I'm not sure how much you actually would need to do that from going from 3rd edition or 3.5 to Pathfinder, but he may have tweaked a few things, I'm not sure. And then he just played with a monster he already knew, but did so in a different game system. You could do the same thing. If you're a big fan of devils and demons, and you love the blood war and the different hierarchy of fiends, none of that is really represented in Daggerheart at all. There are some stat blocks that are meant to be demon or devil equivalents, but there's no real lore or mythology presented along these stat blocks. But if you already have storytelling seeds you want to draw upon from earlier editions, you can do that in Daggerheart really easily. You can just use one of the devil stat blocks, or use a dragon or a war wizard. You can reskin monsters super easily, so they can represent whatever you want them to in the story. However, when Matt ran the Chroma Conclave storyline, he looked at the way the monsters were presented in the monster manual, and made sure to essentially use each dragon as, like, the archetypal version of each chromatic dragon from the book. During the Underdark arc, the Mind Flayers and the Duergar were all very consistent with the lore presented in the monster manual, including the god who was worshipped by the Duergar. In Campaign 2, Matt made a more conscious effort to create his own mythology and deviate from some of the more problematic aspects of D&D's default world building, offering more nuance to the Drow, for example. But that's something he could really only do because he was responding to something that already existed within the books. He was challenging the world building that was being offered by default, and which he had essentially included without questioning it in the first campaign. But if you wanted to do the same thing with your own Daggerheart game, you really can't. You can't tell the archetypal dragon story based on the story threads presented in Daggerheart, because there aren't any. Now, if you want to use one of these campaign frames, then that's no problem at all. I think the campaign frames do a good job of presenting a framework where you can imagine you could drop in any one of these monsters into the game and have enough story threads that you could figure out what you want to do with them. And if you're running a pre-existing campaign setting that you're familiar with from another game or another piece of fiction, then once again, you don't need the game to give you lore when you probably have your own very strong ideas for what you want to do with each of these monsters. And if you're a Critical Role fan coming to Daggerheart, you've seen Matt use a lot of these monsters or very similar monsters across the history of the first 3 campaigns, so these would give you lots of ideas for how to use some of these monsters at your own table. But if you're new to gaming, and you want to invent your own stories that have nothing to do with the campaign frames, Daggerheart doesn't give you much to work with. This is going to seem like a tangent, but it does have a lot to do with what we're discussing right now. I used to be part of a actual play show back when D&D 2014 first came out. When we hit 11th or 12th level, we did an adventure where we wound up in a land of giants. And in the castle, we met a giant belonging to each different giant category. There was a hill giant, a frost giant, a fire giant, and 2 cloud giants. And they'd been ruled over by a storm giant, but she had gone missing. And so there was turmoil in the ranks. These giants had their own hierarchy thanks to the ordning, but now that the storm giant ruler was away, the cats would play. I'm pretty sure that's the expression. And each of the giants represented the archetypal idea of that giant from the monster manual. The hill giant was dumb and subservient to the others. The fire giant was the master of war, and my favorite detail was that there were 2 cloud giants. One of them was good, and one of them was evil, because the 2014 monster manual says there's a 50-50 chance of cloud giants being good or evil. So our DM had chosen to represent that literally within the adventure by having 2 cloud giants, one of each alignment. And then, literally the week we recorded that game, Wizards of the Coast announced that their next adventure was going to be Storm King's Thunder, and I got to tell the producers they'd come up with the exact same idea as the creators of the game for their next big published campaign.
That was the thing that was like kind of like the nail in the coffin of like, there's something interesting here. Because typically on a season, like if we're picking something, especially something specific, we want to delve into, and we're spending a lot of time in that world or with that species or creature or whatever, we want to like do something cool with it. So like just like with the Githyanki, like being in their village on like a face floating through the astral plane.
Yeah,
like
what's
that's cool.
unique about their culture?
Like what's unique and what can we dive into? And like reading the Ordning, it was like, oh man, the Ordning sounds great. Like this is a great environment for like a political, like uprising, revolutionary, like kind of story. You can put like old wars and stuff there. And like you guys have never been to the Feywild, so we can do whatever we want there.
Yeah, exactly.
So it was like, oh yeah, we're definitely doing giants. And I can totally destroy my voice by trying to do far too many accents in one time.
And it's funny that you mentioned that the Ordning is appealing because of all that it offers, because 2 days before we recorded, and I told you this after we recorded.
This has happened a lot.
Okay, so there's a weird theme going on where we happen to hit on things at exactly the right moment. 2 days before we recorded, and you were like deep in it at that point. The story was written. Wizards of the Coast announced, I don't actually think Andrew and Nick, we've talked about this at all. Wizards of the Coast announced that their next module is about giants, specifically about a storm giant vanishing, and other giants rising up and defying the Ordning.
What? Yes! Now, obviously, the timing was the most surprising part of that, but I know that we felt pretty proud of ourselves for basically picking up on the plot threads that the Monster Manual had been seeding, the idea that the Ordning keeps giant society running. And so a great question that you would then ask as a writer is, what happens when something comes along that disrupts the hierarchy? How does giant society react to that? Our story was, no pun intended, much smaller in scope than Storm King's Thunder, but both stories were derived from the same place. The flavor text in the Monster Manual, the lore provided for new game masters to use as inspiration. But if you were playing Daggerheart, a moment like that really couldn't have happened in our campaign. Sure, we could all decide to play Colossus of the Drylands at home, and maybe we'll all come up with some similar ideas for our story as the ones you might see from official actual plays in that setting, like the ones hosted by Darrington Press, or the upcoming miniseries from the folks at Legends of Evantris. But when I look at the monsters in Daggerheart, I'm certainly inspired with the story ideas based on the monster's name, or the art, or the one sentence of flavor text you get about what this monster basically is, but I'm also drawing upon ideas I've had from being part of the D&D community for almost 2 decades. But when I read this book, I'm not sure a new game master has all the same tools they would have when they sit down with the Monster Manual, which really is designed to present monsters with enough lore that it will inspire you to invent your own stories based on these monsters. So ultimately, the question of whether Daggerheart handles world building better than D&D depends on what sort of world building you come to D&D for. I'm perfectly happy for each individual campaign setting to have their own parameters for how the different ancestries are perceived by the people. I don't mind the idea that the average typical people of the world don't trust orcs as long as that is specific to that campaign setting and not baked into the mythology of the game itself. So in that way, I think Daggerheart represents the same trend that we see in other games, like Shadowdark, where you can just play a goblin or an orc, and if you want there to be specific rules for how that player should behave when they play that ancestry, or you want there to be specific social factors in play, like prejudice against that ancestry, that's something you have to handle in the world building category, but it's not a core assumption the game is making anymore. And that way, I think Daggerheart is right in line with its peers. If you're looking for a campaign setting that gives you a lot of ideas of how to run it, I think Daggerheart does an incredible job compared to most of its peers. I'm on the record about disliking the way D&D 2014 presented the Forgotten Realms in a way that didn't really give new game masters the tools to run that world effectively. And I made a whole video about the Greyhawk section of the new DMG, which was the first time in the lifespan of 5e where I felt like the core rulebooks actually gave the game master the tools they needed to run an official setting. But Daggerheart presents these campaign frames that I think do an even better job of not just presenting one world, but half a dozen. And each one exists in their own genre and they have their own mechanics that are designed to support a different flavor of fantasy. D&D does the same thing. They give you different mechanics for different flavors of fantasy, but they don't also give you lore or world details for each of those categories of fantasy, and Daggerheart does. So if that's what you're looking for from the world building of the game, then Daggerheart excels. I think it handles that better than any other RPG I've ever encountered. And Daggerheart can also be reskinned, so you can use the game for lots of different settings. So I could probably use this game for lots of other TTRPG products. I run a Curse of Strahd campaign where the main characters are teenagers from our world. Daggerheart might be a better system for me to use for that game going forward, because sometimes it's a struggle to reskin D&D, so the characters are children from a modern world who are suddenly getting all these magical powers that work in really specific ways. But the folks at Critical Role ran a holiday one-shot in Daggerheart last year where the characters were teenagers from the 80s who had some sort of holiday curse put on them, so they're already demonstrating you could easily reskin this game to play modern kids from our world where magical things happen to them. It's a very flexible system because a lot of the basic rules of Daggerheart don't have world building baked into them, the way you do with D&D and the different rules for how clerics and wizards and druids work and how spells work in general. And I could even use some of the mechanics from something like Age of Umbra in place of some of the mechanics of D&D to help sell how brutal and corrupting the world of Curse of Strahd can be. However, Daggerheart doesn't offer its own lore that isn't tied to one of the campaign frames. So in that way, the monster section of the game isn't the resource of ideas the way the monster manual can so often be when you're playing in other systems. I made a video where I went through Shadowdark and talked about all the implicit world building present in the core rulebook. But for Daggerheart, I was able to cover that same topic in about a paragraph, because this is a game that very specifically does not make a lot of assumptions about its default campaign setting. If you have an idea for a zombie campaign, the monster section has a bunch of different zombies you can use. But if you want to tell the quintessential Daggerheart demon story, well, there is some cool art of different demons that have interesting names. I particularly love the art for the Demon of Hubris, and he's a tier 3 monster. He could easily be the big bad of your entire campaign. But the flavor text simply reads, "A perfectly beautiful and infinitely cruel demon with a gleaming spear and elegant robes." That's it. I've got some ideas for how the Demon of Hubris could be used as the major villain for an entire Daggerheart campaign, but I'm going to have to do a lot of heavy lifting myself, because as far as guidance from the book goes, there's not much to speak of. Really, we're just discussing the different approaches to building an adventure or a campaign. Daggerheart is ideally suited for several of them, but I think it falls short in one particular category. So the question you have to answer is, what parts of a game system do you look to when you're building the story for your campaign? When I built one of my recent adventures for my homebrew campaign, I used Azures as the villains because they were the right challenge rating, and I like their art. And because I was inspired by the art to tell a specific story that had nothing to do with the lore presented in the book. It contradicted the lore. However, one of my next adventures is going to feature my players facing a D&D monster where I love the lore from the monster manual, but I think the monster's stats fall short of the high as promised by such fantastic lore. If I was moving this campaign into Daggerheart, that would be absolutely no problem. I could just pick a new stat block and use that instead. But my love for this monster and my ideas for this adventure are based on flipping through the monster manual, reading the lore, and getting inspired. But you can't get the same experience when reading the monster section of the Daggerheart book because this book's doing something very different. So, yeah, it depends on how you're approaching your campaign and what you tend to expect from your core rulebooks. Daggerheart's approach to world building feels really fresh and versatile and fantastic in so many ways, and leaves me a little let down in one other way. Actually, two, I hate the name Galapa. It makes no sense. It makes sense for our world, where Galapagos is the name of a place where we find turtles, but in the world of Daggerheart, it doesn't make any sense. I don't like it. But anyway, it's possible your world-building needs are very different from mine. Maybe what I find disappointing doesn't bother you at all, or maybe it even excites you about playing Daggerheart. Or maybe I lost you the moment I said there's no core lore for the ancestries or classes. Regardless of how you feel, sound off in the comments below and let me know how you feel about Daggerheart's approach to world-building. And I've got a lot more I can say about Daggerheart, so if there's some particular aspect of the game you want me to talk about in a future video, let me know in the comments below. And if you're interested in seeing more Daggerheart videos, subscribe to the channel. I've got a lot of other Daggerheart videos planned, so if people respond really well to this one, that'll help me feel incentivized to make more videos about that game and trust that my audience is interested in watching them and they're not going to get buried by the algorithm. I'm also definitely making more Daggerheart videos this week because I was literally cursed by an algorithm wizard. Long story, it's been a whole thing. Daggerheart is a very cinematic game, and I have a whole series of videos where I talk about applying story structure from movies and TV shows to our games. So if you're interested in Daggerheart, check out these videos. The most recent entry is right here. It's about using cutaways in your game. It also just so happens to be one of the longest videos I've ever made, and people seem to really like it. So please check it out. It would mean a lot to me. Until next time, play fair and have fun.